The Red Badge of Courage, Chapter 14, continued. "Oh, here now, boys. What's the use?" he said. "We'll all be the Rebs in less than an hour. What's the good fightin' amongst ourselves?" One of the light-footed soldiers turned upon him, red-faced and violent. "You needn't come round here with ye preachin'. I suppose you don't approve of fightin', since Charlie Morgan licked you. Yea, but I don't see what business this here is yours or anybody else." "Well, it ain't," said the friend mildly. "Still, I hate to see." That was a tangled argument. "Well, he," said the two, indicating their opponent with accusative forefingers. The huge soldier was quite purple with rage. He pointed at the two soldiers with his great hand extended claw-like. "Well, But during this argumentative time, the desire to deal blows seemed to pass, although they said much to each other. Finally, the friend returned to his old seat. In a short while, the three antagonists could be seen together in an amiable bunch. "Jimmy Rogers says I'll have to fight him after the battle today," announced the friend as he again seated himself. "He says he don't allow no interfering in his business. I hate to see the boys been fighting amongst themselves." The youth laughed. "You changed a good bit. You ain't at all like you was. I remember when you and that Irish feller—" He stopped and laughed again. "No, I didn't use it to be that way," said his friend thoughtfully. "That's true enough." "Well, I didn't mean—" began the youth. The friend made another depreciatory gesture. "Oh, yeah, needn't mind, Henry." There was another little pause. "The regiment lost over half the men yesterday," remarked the friend eventually. "I thought, of course, they was all dead, but laws, they kept a-comin' back last night, and until it seems, after all, we didn't lose but a few. They'd been scattered all over, wandering round the woods, fightin' with other regiments and everything, just like you done." "So?" said the youth. Chapter 15. The regiment was standing in order at order arms at the side of a lane, waiting for the command to march, when suddenly the youth remembered the little packet enwrapped in a faded yellow envelope which the loud young soldier, with lugubrious words, had entrusted to him. It made him start. He uttered an exclamation and turned toward his comrade. "Wilson!" His friend, at his side in the ranks, was thoughtfully staring down the road. From some cause, his expression was at that moment very meek. The youth, regarding him with sidelong glances, felt impelled to change his purpose. "Oh, nothing," he said. His friend turned his head in some surprise. "Why? What was you going to say?" "Oh, nothing," repeated the youth. He resolved not to deal the little blow. It was sufficient that the fact made him glad. It was not necessary to knock his friend on the head with the misguided packet. He had been possessed of much fear of his friend, for he saw how easily questionings could make holes in his feelings. Lately he had assured himself that the altered comrade would not tantalize him with a persistent curiosity, but he felt certain that during the first period of leisure his friend would ask him to relate his adventures of the previous day. He now rejoiced in the possession of a small weapon with which he could prostrate his comrade at the first signs of a cross-examination. He was master. It would now be he who would laugh and shoot the shafts of derision. The friend had, in a weak hour, spoken with sobs of his own death. He had delivered a melancholy oration previous to his funeral, and had doubtless, in the packet of letters, presented various keepsakes to relatives. But he had not died, and thus he had delivered himself into the hands of the youth. The latter felt immensely superior to his friend, but he inclined to condescension. He adopted toward him an air of patronizing good humor. His self-pride was now entirely restored. In the shade of its flourishing growth, he stood with braced and self-confident legs, and since nothing could now be discovered, he did not shrink from an encounter with the eyes of judges, and allowed no thoughts of his own to keep him from an attitude of manfulness. He had performed his mistakes in the dark, so he was still a man. Indeed, when he remembered his fortunes of yesterday and looked at them from a distance, he began to see something fine there. He had license to be pompous and veteran-like. His panting agonies of the past he put out of his sight. In the present, he declared to himself that it was only the doomed and the damned who roared with sincerity at circumstance. Few, but they ever did it. A man with a full stomach and the respect of his fellows had no business to scold about anything that he might think to be wrong in the ways of the universe, or even with the ways of society. Let the unfortunates rail, the others may play marbles. He did not give a great deal of thought to these battles that lay directly before him. It was not essential that he should plan his ways in regard to them. He had been taught that many obligations of a life were easily avoided. The lessons of yesterday had been that retribution was a laggard and blind. With these facts before him, he did not deem it necessary that he should become feverish over the possibilities of the ensuing 24 hours. He could leave much to chance. Besides, a faith in himself had secretly blossomed. There was a little flower of confidence growing within him. He was now a man of experience. He had been out among the dragons, he said, and he assured himself that they were not so hideous as he had imagined them. Also, they were inaccurate. They did not sting with precision. A stout heart often defied, and defying, escaped. And furthermore, how could they kill him, who was the chosen of gods and doomed to greatness? He remembered how some of the men had run from the battle. As he recalled their terror-struck faces, he felt a scorn for them. They had surely been more fleet and more wild than was absolutely necessary. They were weak mortals. As for himself, he had fled with discretion and dignity. He was aroused from this reverie by his friend, who, having hitched about nervously and blinked at the trees for a time, suddenly coughed in an introductory way and spoke. "Fleming!" "What?" The friend put his hand up to his mouth and coughed again. He fidgeted in his jacket. "Well," he gulped at last, "I guess she might have as well give me back them letters." Dark, prickling blood had flushed into his cheeks and brow. "All right, Wilson," said the youth. He loosened 2 buttons of his coat, thrust in his hand, and brought forth the packet. As he extended it to his friend, the latter's face was turned from him. He had been slow in the act of producing the packet, because during it he had been trying to invent a remarkable comment upon the affair. He could conjure nothing of sufficient point. He was compelled to allow his friend to escape unmolested with his packet, and for this he took unto himself considerable credit. It was a generous thing. His friend at his side seemed suffering great shame as he contemplated him. The youth felt his heart grow more strong and stout. He had never been compelled to blush in such manner for his acts. He was an individual of extraordinary virtues. He reflected with condescending pity, too bad, the poor devil, it makes him feel tough. After this incident, and as he reviewed the battle pictures he had seen, he felt quite competent to return home and make the hearts of the people glow with stories of war. He could see himself in a room of warm tints, telling tales to the listeners. He would exhibit laurels. They were insignificant still in a district where laurels were infrequent. They might shine. He saw his gaping audience picturing him as the central figure in blazing scenes, and he imagined the consternation and the ejaculations of his mother and the young lady at the seminary as they drank his recitals. Their vague feminine formula for beloved ones doing brave deeds on the field of battle without risk of life would be destroyed. Chapter 16. A sputtering of musketry was always to be heard. Later the cannon had entered the dispute. In the fog-filled air, their voices made a thudding sound. The reverberations were continued. This part of the world led a strange battlefield existence. The youth's regiment was marched to relieve a command that had lain long in some damp trenches. The men took positions behind a curving line of rifle pits that had been turned up like a large furrow along the line of woods. Before them was a level stretch, peopled with short, deformed stumps. From the woods beyond came the dull popping of the skirmishers and pickets, firing in the fog. From the right came the noise of a terrific fracas. The men cuddled behind the small embankment and sat in the easy attitudes awaiting their turn. Many had their backs to the firing. The youth's friend lay down, buried his face in his arms, and almost instantly, it seemed, he was in a deep sleep. The youth leaned his breast against the brown dirt and peered over at the woods and up and down the line. Curtains of trees interfered with his ways of vision. He could see the low line of trenches, but for a short distance. A few idle flags were perched on the dirt hills. Behind them were rows of dark bodies with a few heads sticking curiously over the top. Always the noise of skirmishers came from the woods on the front and left, and the din on the right had grown to frightful proportions. The guns were roaring without an instant's pause for breath. It seemed that the cannon had come from all parts and were engaged in a stupendous wrangle. It became impossible to make a sentence heard. The youth wished to launch a joke, a quotation from newspapers. He desired to say, "All quiet on the Rappahannock," but the guns refused to permit even a comment upon their uproar. He never successfully concluded the sentence, but at last the guns stopped, and among the men in the rifle pits rumors again flew like birds, but they were now for the most part black creatures who flapped their wings drearily near to the ground and refused to rise on any wings of hope. The men's faces grew doleful from the interpreting of omens. Tales of hesitation and uncertainty on the part of those high in place and responsibility came to their ears. Stories of disaster were borne into the minds with many proofs. This din of musketry on the right, growing like a released genie of sound, expressed and emphasized the army's plight. The men were disheartened and began to mutter. They made gestures expressive of the sentence, "Ah, what more can we do?" And it could always be seen that they were bewildered by the alleged news and could not fully comprehend a defeat. Before the gray mists had been totally obliterated by the sun rays, the regiment was marching in a spread column that was retiring carefully through the woods. The disordered, hurrying lines of the enemy could sometimes be seen down through the groves and little fields. They were yelling shrill and exultant. At this sight, the youth forgot many personal matters and became greatly enraged. He exploded in loud sentences. "By Jiminy, we're generaled by a lot of lunkheads." "More than one feller had said that today," observed a man. His friend, recently aroused, was still very drowsy. He looked behind him until his mind took in the meaning of the movement. Then he sighed. "Oh, well, I suppose we got licked," he remarked sadly. The youth had a thought that it would not be handsome for him to freely condemn other men. He made an attempt to restrain himself, but the words upon his tongue were too bitter. He presently began a long and intricate denunciation of the commander of the forces. "Maybe it wasn't all his fault, not altogether. He did the best he knowed. It's our luck to get licked often," said his friend in a weary tone. He was trudging along with stooped shoulders and shifting eyes like a man who had been caned and kicked. "Well, don't we fight like the devil? Don't we do all that men can?" demanded the youth loudly. He was secretly dumbfounded at the sentiment when it came from his lips. For a moment his face lost its valor, and he looked guiltily about him. But no one questioned his right to deal in such words, and presently he recovered his air of courage. He went on to repeat a statement he had heard going from group to group at the camp that morning. The brigadier said he never saw a new regiment fight the way we fought yesterday, didn't he? And we didn't do better than any another regiment, did we? Well then, you can say that the army's fault, can you? In his reply, the friend's voice was stern. Of course not, he said. No man dares say we don't fight like the devil. No man ever dares say it. The boys fight like hell roosters, but still, we don't have no luck. Well then, if we fight like the devil and don't ever whip, it must be the general's fault, said the youth grandly and decisively. And I don't see any sense in fighting. You're always losing through some derned old lunkhead of a general. A sarcastic man who was tramping at the youth's side then spoke lazily. Maybe you think you fit the whole battle yesterday, Fleming, he remarked. The speech pierced the youth. Inwardly he was reduced to an abject pulp by these chance words. His legs quaked privately. He cast a frightened glance at the sarcastic man. Why so? He hastened to say in a conciliatory voice. I don't think I fought the whole battle yesterday. But the other seemed innocent of any deeper meaning. Apparently he had no information. It was merely his habit. Oh, he replied in the same tone of calm derision. The youth, nevertheless, felt a threat. His mind shrank from going nearer to the danger, and thereafter he was silent. The significance of the sarcastic man's word took from him all loud moods that would make him appear prominent. He became suddenly a modest person. There was low-toned talk among the troops. The officers were impatient and snappy, their countenances clouded with the tales of misfortune. The troops, sifting through the forest, were sullen. In the youth's company, once a man's laugh rang out, a dozen soldiers turned their faces quickly toward him and frowned with vague displeasure. The noise of firing dogged their footsteps. Sometimes it seemed to be driven a little way, but it always returned again with increased insolence. The men muttered and cursed, throwing black looks in its direction. In a clear space, the troops were at last halted. Regiments and brigades, broken and detached through their encounters with thickets, grew together again, and lines were faced toward the pursuing bark of the enemy's infantry. This noise, following like the yellings of eager, metallic hounds, increased to a loud and joyous burst, and then, as the sun went serenely up the sky, throwing illuminating rays into the gloomy thickets, it broke forth into prolonged pealings. The woods began to crackle as if afire. "Whoop-de-dee," said a man. "Here we are, everybody fighting, blood and destruction." I was willing to bet they'd attack as soon as the sun got fairly up, savagely asserted the lieutenant who commanded the youth's company. He jerked without mercy at his little mustache. He strode to and fro with dark dignity in the rear of his men, who were lying down behind whatever protection they had collected. A battery had trundled into position in the rear and was thoughtfully shelling the distance. The regiment, unmolested as yet, awaited the moment when the gray shadows of the woods before them should be slashed by the lines of flame. There was much growling and swearing. "Good God," the youth grumbled, we're always being chased around like rats. It makes me sick. Nobody seems to know where we go or why we go. We just get fired around from pillar to post and get licked here and licked there and nobody knows what it's done for. It makes a man feel like a damn kitten in a bag. Now, I'd like to know what the eternal thunders we was marching into these woods for anyhow, unless it was to give the Rebs a regular pot shot at us. We came in here and got like our legs all tangled up in these cussed briars, and then we began to fight, and the Rebs had an easy time of it. Don't tell me it's just luck. I know better. It's this darned old..." The friend seemed jaded, but he interrupted his comrade with the voice of calm confidence. "It'll turn out all right in the end," he said. "Oh, the devil it will. You always talk like a dog-hanged person. Don't tell me. I know. At this time there was an interposition by the savage-minded lieutenant, who was obliged to vent some of his inward dissatisfaction upon his men. "You boys shut right up. There's no need at your wasting your breath in long-winded arguments about this and that and the other. You've been jawing like a lot of old hens. All you got to do is fight, and you'll get plenty. And that in about 10 minutes.